How affairs quietly destroyed Hollywood's golden icons. Hollywood in the 1960s and 1970s was celebrated as an era of freedom, rebellion, and creative liberation. But beneath that glamorous image existed an industry that demanded emotional exposure while offering no protection from the damage it caused. Love was encouraged only when it could be staged, controlled, and monetized, and the moment it became complicated, obsessive, or publicly uncomfortable, it turned into a liability. Affairs were not simply personal choices during this era. They became weapons used by tabloids, studios, and audiences to reshape reputations and quietly discard people who no longer fit the fantasy. The stars discussed here were not careless or talentless figures who faded naturally, but cultural giants whose personal relationships slowly unraveled their careers, identities, and mental stability. This was a time when the star system was dying, but the paparazzi culture was being born, a transitional period where the old protections were gone, but the new exploitations were just beginning. To understand these icons, one must understand the architecture of their isolation. They lived in a world where intimacy was a performance and privacy was a luxury they could never afford. So before judging their decisions, ask yourself honestly, how many people could survive if their most private emotions were turned into lifelong public trials? The architecture of obsession, the systemic trap. Before we look at the individuals, we must look at the machinery. Hollywood has always operated on a paradox. It sells the idea of relatable humanity through people who are treated as anything but human. In the 1960s, as the Hays Code, the industry's moral censorship began to crumble. The public's appetite for realism grew. However, this realism wasn't just demanded on screen, it was demanded in the bedrooms and back seats of the stars. The studio fixers, like the legendary Eddie Mannix, who once buried scandals with a phone call, were being replaced by a more ruthless predator, the independent tabloid. Gossip was no longer just chatter, it was a multi-million-dollar industry. For an actor, an affair wasn't just a mistake. It was a breach of a purity contract that the audience held over their heads. When desire became public, it stopped being love and started being a liability. Elizabeth Taylor, when love became a public sentence. Elizabeth Taylor entered adulthood already emotionally exhausted, shaped by a childhood spent under intense studio control where affection, approval, and survival were tightly connected. From an early age, she learned that being desired meant being safe, that emotional intensity meant meaning, and that love was inseparable from identity. When her affair with Richard Burton began during the filming of Cleopatra, it never existed privately, even for a moment. This was the dawn of the modern celebrity scandal. Newspapers followed her relentlessly. Magazines transformed speculation into certainty, and religious leaders condemned her openly. Even the Vatican weighed in, labeling her an erotic vagrant. Politicians used her name as shorthand for moral decay. What should have been a personal relationship became a global spectacle, one where Taylor was no longer treated as a human being, but as a cultural warning. Taylor's life became a masterclass in survival through dissociation. The studio had taught her that her face was a product, but her affairs taught her that her heartbeat was a commodity. When the world condemned her for the Burton affair, they weren't just judging her morality. They were punishing her for breaking the girl next door contract she never signed. The tragedy of Taylor wasn't that she loved too much, but that she was never allowed to love in the dark. Every intimate whisper was amplified by a telephoto lens, turning her private sanctuary into a soundstage. As the years passed, the punishment never truly stopped. Every illness she suffered was framed as excess, every surgery as consequence, and every emotional breakdown as proof that she was unstable. Hollywood, which once protected her image aggressively, began withdrawing creative trust, offering fewer roles that required discipline or subtlety and more appearances that relied on spectacle. By the 1970s, Elizabeth Taylor remained omnipresent in popular culture, yet increasingly absent from serious artistic discussion, trapped inside a persona the world refused to let her escape. When a person is never allowed to step outside a single narrative, Do they ever truly heal, or do they simply learn to survive inside the wound? Richard Burton, a brilliant mind consumed by exposure. Richard Burton entered his relationship with Elizabeth Taylor not as a reckless celebrity, but as a deeply intellectual actor who felt increasingly alienated by fame. Trained in classical theater, he valued language, control, and emotional precision. Yet Hollywood reduced him to spectacle once his private life became inseparable from his public image. For Burton, the affair was a collision of high art and low impulse. He was a man of words who found himself trapped in a world of images. He often spoke of the great betrayal, the feeling that by becoming a global superstar through his romantic proximity to Taylor, he had committed treason against his own talent. The relationship was intense, passionate, and volatile, amplified by jealousy, insecurity, and relentless media attention. Burton's drinking escalated not because he lacked ambition, but because ambition became unbearable in a life that never slowed down. The drinking wasn't just a vice. It was a chemical shield against the realization that he had become a supporting character in his own life story. The more the public obsessed over his jewelry purchases and his volatile fights, the less they heard the cadence of his voice. Professionally, the consequences appeared gradually but decisively. Directors questioned his reliability, studios hesitated to insure him, and critics began noting a decline in the sharpness that once defined his performances. Burton later admitted that the emotional labor of sustaining the relationship drained the energy that once fueled his craft. He was a king who had traded his kingdom for a crown of glass, realizing too late that in Hollywood, the more you are seen, the less you are actually known. His health deteriorated, his voice weakened, and the possibility of being remembered primarily for his artistry faded beneath the weight of scandal. When he died, the chaos was remembered more vividly than the brilliance. When passion demands everything, how much of the self can be lost before nothing remains? Warren Beatty, the quiet damage of endless affairs. Warren Beatty's story is often misunderstood because it lacks dramatic collapse, yet its damage is subtle, cumulative, and deeply revealing. During the 1960s and 1970s, his endless affairs were celebrated as symbols of masculine freedom rather than examined for emotional cost. Women entered relationships with him believing they were chosen, only to encounter emotional distance, indecision, and avoidance that left lasting psychological impact. Beatty avoided public scandal not because his relationships were healthy, but because he avoided emotional depth altogether. His success in avoiding the wreckage that claimed Taylor or Burton was its own kind of failure. By treating intimacy as a game of chess, he protected his reputation but hollowed out his legacy. The quiet damage wasn't just felt by the women he left behind. It was a slow-acting poison in his own creative well. Over time, this pattern reshaped how both the industry and audiences perceived him. His romantic mythology eclipsed his artistic identity, and his creative output became increasingly sporadic. While he remained successful, his career lacked emotional continuity, as if restlessness had seeped into his professional discipline. When an artist avoids the vulnerability of a deep, messy, and perhaps even scandalous commitment, their work often begins to feel like a polished mirror, reflective and bright, but ultimately cold. Beatty became the architect of his own isolation, proving that you can survive the Hollywood system by never giving it anything real to break. But the price of that safety is a life lived in the shallow end of the soul. His life raises an uncomfortable question rarely asked in celebrity culture. If someone survives by never fully engaging, are they truly free, or have they simply learned how to disappear slowly? Natalie Wood, when love turned into fear. Natalie Wood's vulnerability was shaped by a childhood spent performing for approval rather than developing emotional safety. From an early age, she learned that love was conditional and that success could vanish without warning. This was the legacy of her mother, Maria Gurdon, who treated Natalie's beauty as a family business. As an adult, her relationships were marked by a desperate fear of abandonment, jealousy, and deep self-doubt, intensified rather than eased by fame. Her marriage to Robert Wagner alternated between comfort and tension, while her rumored involvement with Warren Beatty deepened feelings of inadequacy and comparison. For Wood, an affair wasn't just a romantic diversion. It was a search for the solid shore she had never known. The tragedy was that in the world of Hollywood, there are no shores, only mirrors. She lived in a state of hypervigilance, aware that the same cameras that made her immortal were the ones recording her slow disintegration. The long pain of Natalie Wood was the realization that she was most alone when she was most desired. As her career slowed in the late 1970s, Wood faced the terrifying erosion of identity that many actors fear but few are prepared for. The emotional weight of her relationships, combined with professional uncertainty, created a quiet despair that remained largely invisible. When her life ended suddenly, the public focused on mystery rather than meaning, avoiding deeper reflection on the emotional suffering that preceded her death. We are more comfortable speculating about endings, about boats and dark water, than confronting the long pain that leads to them. Her life was a series of attempts to find a safe place to land, only to find that every hand reached out to her was holding a script or a camera. Montgomery Clift, destroyed by silence, not scandal. Montgomery Clift's tragedy unfolded without tabloid explosions, yet it may be the most devastating of all. A deeply sensitive actor, Clift lived in an industry that demanded repression, secrecy, and emotional conformity. Forced to suppress essential parts of himself, including his personal identity and his true relationships, he lived in constant internal conflict. This repression, combined with addiction and isolation, slowly dismantled his health and confidence. Clift's silence was the loudest thing in Hollywood. While others' affairs were fodder for the trades, his very existence was a threat to the industry's manufactured dream. The slow-motion suicide of his later years was the only way he could express the agony of a man forced to play a part 24 hours a day. Hollywood praised his talent, but offered no protection for his humanity. His decline was visible, yet largely ignored. After his horrific car accident, which shattered his face and his sense of self, the industry's reaction was telling. They didn't see a man in pain. They saw a ruined product. He didn't just lose his looks. He lost the ability to hide behind the mask of the leading man. Hollywood will forgive a scandal, but it will never forgive a broken mirror. His decline was visible, yet largely ignored. And when he died young, the industry mourned briefly before erasing him from mainstream conversation. He became a ghost before he even died, a reminder that the most dangerous affair in Hollywood is the one you have with your own suppressed truth. His story forces an uncomfortable reflection. How many artists were destroyed not by scandal, but by systems that refused to let them live honestly? The aftermath, the price of a spectacle. We look back at these 5 figures and see a pattern of excess, but that is a convenient lie. The excess was not in their hearts. It was in the expectations placed upon them. By the late 1970s, the golden age, icons were being replaced by a new generation of relatable stars, but the damage was done. Taylor was a caricature, Burton was a memory, Beatty was a recluse, Wood was a ghost, and Clift was a footnote. Their affairs were the only way they knew how to reach out for human connection in a world that treated them like monuments. But when a monument starts to bleed, the public doesn't offer a bandage. They take a picture. We must look at these icons not as cautionary tales of morality, but as casualties of a voyeuristic hunger that has only grown more ravenous with time. The curse of desire was not a supernatural force. It was a collective choice made by a public that demanded the intimacy of stars without ever offering them the grace of privacy. We didn't just watch them fall. We built the heights from which they tumbled. Their stories remain relevant because the machine has not changed, only the speed at which it consumes. Conclusion: why we stop talking about them. These actors are rarely discussed today with the depth they deserve, not because they lacked greatness, but because their lives expose truths Hollywood prefers to bury. Their affairs were not isolated moral failures. They were symptoms of a system that blurred emotional boundaries, encouraged excess, and punished vulnerability once it became inconvenient. When these stars stopped representing fantasy and started representing consequence, they were quietly removed from cultural memory. We prefer our icons frozen in their youth before the lines of pain etched themselves into their faces. We want the tailor of Cat on a hot tin roof, not the tailor who wept for a love the world wouldn't let her have. We want the Burton of Hamlet, not the Burton who drank to forget he was a celebrity. The final question is not about them. It is about us. We watched, judged, consumed, and moved on. We turned their heartbreak into entertainment and their trauma into trivia. So when the next beautiful life begins to unravel in public view, when the next affair is exposed for our consumption, will we see a headline, or will we finally see a human being slowly breaking under pressure? As we look back at the wreckage of these golden icons, we are forced to ask, are we seeking to understand their pain, or are we just looking for a more high-definition way to watch them break? The history of Hollywood is written in the blood of those who dared to be human in a land of gods. And until we change the way we look at them, the curse of desire will continue to claim the best of us.